Well, hey there. Welcome back to the Intergenerational Trauma Therapist Show, where we talk about all things intergenerational trauma therapy. And this year, we're working through a 2024 Intergenerational Trauma Therapist Immersion Calendar, where each month and each week we have different themes that help us learn kind of the foundation of intergenerational trauma and intergenerational trauma therapy so that we know if we need to specialize further and all the skills that are kind of needed to practice in this area. So this week is week 4 in January, and we are looking at developmental trauma in teens and children and teens. So if you haven't gotten a copy of the calendar yet, you can go to calendar.barbarawoodsphd.com, and that'll take you right through the process to get it. It's free, and you'll get weekly emails with any updates and additional content. So this week, we're going to look at how developmental trauma impacts our clients when they're young, when they're either children or teens, the impacts on emotional, behavioral, social, and cognitive skills, and the impacts in those domains. We'll look at the best assessment tools, useful interventions, the challenges that happen in families to maintain contact when there's developmental trauma, and parenting strategies and interventions. And of course, we always want to keep cultural considerations on top of mind when we're working with people impacted by intergenerational trauma. So first, we're going to look at those impacts on the child or teen. So basically, the definition of developmental trauma is trauma that occurs during a significant developmental period, and it's usually ongoing over time. It can be ranging from neglect, where needs weren't met or certain things were not present that were needed, like being seen, heard, understood, to having kind of overt acts, living in violent communities, being exposed to domestic violence, child abuse, all those things that happen during that critical developmental period can also include attachment disruptions. So the primary age where we look for these is 0 to 3, because that is an extremely significant developmental period, but it can really happen, I would say, up to like 21, because that's like the brain development period where there's rapid connections being made. And that's where there's a lot of impacts in those developmental domains. The most significant impacts for that 0 to 3 age are the implicit trauma. So implicit trauma is trauma that is there, but people aren't aware of what it is. It didn't happen during a time when language could connect the event to what the person experienced. So the experience is in there, but they don't have language to describe it. So it's basically not a conscious memory, but it's a memory. So a lot of people think that children between 0 and 3, or up to 5, they really don't remember trauma and they're not impacted by it, but they're actually impacted by it very significantly. So where you'll see these impacts are in 7 major domains, and they include attachment. So it interrupts the parent-child relationship. You'll see it in biological development. So that would be like sensory integration, some of the like processes that are related to health and wellness. So you'll see later on health concerns, fibromyalgia, heart conditions, all those kinds of things can be tied back to that biological development. Affect regulation is really like emotion regulation, so that sometimes they're either flat and don't express or experience a lot of emotion, or they're highly volatile emotionally and they can't regulate themselves well. Dissociation is also a hallmark impact, that the level of trauma that kids experience with developmental trauma is quite significant, and it causes them to have the need to kind of check out of the the current circumstances for self-protection and for survival. So you'll see different characteristics of dissociation, behavioral control. So you'll see impulsivity and or kind of a flatness, low motivation, cognition. The experiencing trauma kind of hijacks the higher cortical experiences that they can't process information at the same level if they didn't have that hijacking happen. So it can impact cognitive development and definitely impacts the self-concept and how they see themselves, if they see themselves as a good kid that people love, or if they see themselves as a really bad person that's unlovable. So we're going to go deeper into the emotional, behavioral, and social impacts and cognitive impacts. So the emotional impacts, there's typically, we talked about affect dysregulation, there's typically really significant emotional dysregulation. So if they have an experience where they get angry, it's a volatile anger and it's hard to regulate, it's hard to bring it back down and get into a regulated state. They may not be able to identify or label feelings, so there will be kind of a missing ability to label their feelings and understand what they're actually feeling. So these are the kids and teens and adults that you might see that when you ask them, well, how did that impact you? Or how did you feel about that? They might just shrug their shoulders and not, I don't know. And it's not that they're not trying to engage with you. They really don't know. So that can have a huge impact on identifying how we move through the world and how the world impacts us. They're also disconnected from internal states. So there's that dissociation can be kind of cutting your head off from your body and not having awareness of internal states, which is a protective mechanism so that they don't have to deal with the overwhelm or the degree of fight or flight that they're experiencing. But it becomes a problem because then they don't recognize danger later, or they don't have the body awareness that they need to have accurate neuroception, to have all those aspects where those internal bodily feelings and sensations are important. And eventually it becomes very difficult for kids and teens who have been impacted by developmental trauma. It's very hard for them to assert what they need in relationships and to express those or to get their needs met. So you may see kind of go one way or another, and there's always shades of variation in the middle. They may become very aggressive that I need this done and you are going to meet this for me, or they will just not have any needs and they'll just kind of please other people, or just kind of deny that they even need anything. So you can see a whole range of things, responses between there when they can't express what they need in relationships. With behavioral impacts, you'll see a lot of impulsivity. So they'll be quick to act. Their actions will be stronger or more severe than what it matches the situation. They can become quite aggressive because of that fight-flight response, that they can have neuroception of danger and threat, and they attack to keep themselves safe. Now, in an environment where they truly aren't safe, and that response, that fight or flight response, is done to maintain their safety and it works, that's accurate neuroception. Might be problematic, might cause more difficulties for the child if there's an adult that gets even more angry or more abusive. But when it happens in the middle of class or with a group of peers, that's where it becomes a difficulty and it can have a negative impact. And that would be more faulty neuroception. There can also be a tendency to have a lot of self-destruction. So that would be making really difficult choices or doing things that are impulsive, like running out in front of cars or doing things where they just don't care about themselves. So they will end up having some really self-destructive behavior. Some of these are going to be coping skills that are negative and self-destructive. So they can't learn to soothe themselves well. So they'll turn to substance abuse, running away, stealing cars. I know I've worked with a few teens who have stolen cars. They've carjacked people, and they describe it as when they got in the car, they just felt so alive and they had felt so numb before. So that's kind of a self-soothing, or kind of trying to get connected to the body, but it's very self-destructive as well. Another behavioral characteristic you'll see is either extreme compliance or very oppositional. So some of the kids with that fight or flight response will really dig their heels in. They'll be verbally aggressive, physically aggressive, and they'll be very oppositional. They will not do anything for an adult because it might make them vulnerable. Or they may be very compliant, where they're at very high risk for other traumas to happen because they either don't recognize danger, or they kind of go along and please and appease, and don't recognize that danger. They usually have difficulty following rules. And I had a little 5-year-old years and years ago that came in, and I told her kind of the rules of the building and that kind of stuff, which there weren't really that many, but her little chin jutted out and she said, "Who's the boss of this place anyway?" And I was like, 5 years old, asking who the boss is. Like, this is going to be fun. So I told her it was me, and it was like a shocked reaction. But this is part of what happens. They get very defensive and dominant because they don't feel safe with adults. So they always kind of push back and have a lot of difficulty following rules. They can also have repetitive behavior related to the trauma. So if they're in a situation of domestic violence, they may end up becoming violent with their peers and continually getting in fights. And it's kind of a reenactment or repetition of that behavior that's related to the trauma. You can see this in play therapy too, where if you're doing, say, sand tray or any kind of play where they're kind of in imaginary play, the theme will constantly be one person beating another one up, or it'll constantly be a repetition of that trauma. And it gets stuck, and that can actually re-traumatize them. So you need to have skills and ways to kind of move them past that when you recognize that repetition. Socially, kids and teens with developmental trauma can have pretty complicated or poor relationships with peers. They tend to gravitate towards other peers who are also struggling, which may kind of be like a cataclysmic event where they get into a lot of trouble together. Sometimes they don't feel close to other people. There's that defensive dominance, where that's a principle by Gordon Neufeld that is like they're very defensive and they're very dominant because they don't feel safe in relationships. But what they really need is an adult to help them feel safe, secure, and attached. They tend to have boundary difficulties. So you'll see either completely shut down and not kind of responsive, not getting close to other people, not trusting, or you'll see they're too trusting, and they'll sit on a stranger's lap, or they'll ask a stranger if they can go home with them. And that's an attachment behavior, but it's also those difficulties with boundaries that are there because of the trauma that they've experienced. They can have low trust, so they may not trust adults, other people, or they can be over trusting. So they'll go along with a stranger somewhere, or they'll not be able to sense that danger. They can also have difficulty with perspective taking. So they won't be able to understand what another person may have been thinking or feeling when a certain event happened. So they may not understand like why another person got upset with them or got angry, or why they were laughing at something. They can't understand the other perspective because they're so overwhelmed and focused on survival and taking care of themselves. And if you can't take perspective and you have kind of difficulties in these relationships and with boundaries, of course, you're going to have difficulties attuning with other people. So you won't be able to recognize their thoughts or feelings. So kids who are impacted by developmental trauma, kids and teens may not understand or may not be able to connect with people and attune to what they're thinking or feeling, which has huge implications for peer relationships, relationships with teachers, relationships with parents. It's a huge impact in their social skills and their social interactions. So the cognitive impacts are our next broad area. So you can see difficulties with focusing and attention. A lot of kids who have developmental trauma may be misdiagnosed or may look like they have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and they may be medicated. Sometimes that medication will help, and sometimes the interventions for ADHD, they just don't work. And that may be because the root of the problem isn't addressed, which is actually the developmental trauma. The executive functioning can be really compromised. So that's like planning, judgment, problem solving, emotion regulation, getting started on a task, switching to another task. All of those things can become very difficult for kids with developmental trauma because the brain is so focused on survival that the energy isn't going to these other higher centers that are developing those executive functioning skills. And children and teens are in a huge span of executive functioning development. So when they have trauma during this time, the brain is hijacked. They don't get that energy to the centers that are related to executive functioning. They don't develop those skills. You can see some language difficulties where there's like a poverty of speech, where they don't have a broad range of words to describe things or ways to use language. They may have reading, writing difficulties, again, because the brain has been hijacked and more focused on survival. And they may also have difficulties with taking responsibility because of some of the social impacts of taking perspective of another person, attuning to them, relationship impacts. They may have a lot of difficulty taking responsibility. And sometimes I've seen it where parents or teachers get locked into like trying to get the child to take responsibility, but the child was in a survival mode where they thought their nervous system neurocepted that they were in total life threat or danger. And so of course they're going to try to justify their behavior. We have to help them get to a state of safety and connection, then review the behavior and help them see that there's other perspectives and different ways to handle things. But it takes that safety and connection to be able to help them take responsibility. So these impacts manifest in everyday life, in relationships, in school, in work, and there's some real long-term consequences. So the first one is that there can be really poor social relationships and poor school performance. And then this reinforces their negative self-belief. So if they grow up thinking they're not a good kid, or nobody loves them, or they're not smart, and they have these difficulties in relationships and in school because their brain has been hijacked, it's going to reinforce that negative self-belief. They may give up. They may feel like it's just another layer of not being a good person, where that's not true, right? It's their experiences that have kind of loaded in a neural network that then just keeps collecting experiences to confirm that neural network of, I'm not a good kid, I'm not safe, the world is a terrible place. If they're misdiagnosed with ADHD, the trauma diagnosis is missed, and the interventions for ADHD don't work, then they're going to grow up with a sense of kind of a lot of failure, having a lot of difficulties, and it's going to be really hard for them to really engage in work, school, and relationships later on. So they may have poor employment skills or a low level of opportunity. Addictions is um, a really significant outcome for a lot of these kids because it's a negative self-soothing skill. It also works to take away all the anxiety and the high reactivity of the nervous system, but it certainly causes other difficulties down the road. Um, they can end up having high risk behavior in relationships. So they might be in multiple relationships at one time. They might be in and out of relationships. They may have very stormy relationships. So there's a lot of high risk around relationships later in life. And as an adult, if the developmental trauma isn't stopped or arrested and kind of healed so that some of these impacts are kind of smoothed over or taken care of, it will turn into complex trauma, which those are just it's the same, they're really the same thing. I like to use the distinction between developmental with children and teens and complex trauma in adults so that we can see where that intergenerational piece is and where the transmission can happen in that parent-child relationship. Assessment tools for developmental trauma they're so complicated. I could probably go on for a whole week of these, but we're going to look at standardized assessments and clinical developmental assessment. And we're going to focus more on the clinical developmental because it really helps you be able to decipher the impacts on the child. So the standard assessments may be your cognitive skills, your academic skills, maybe adaptive skills if they're having difficulties with organization and self-care and daily activities. And it may be the emotional behavioral. So that's like your WISC, your cognitive Woodcock-Johnson, academic, your Woodcock-Johnson, and the emotional behavior may be like a BASC, where you can get different kind of a read on their kind of overall umbrella of emotional behavioral presentation. And trauma assessments are also very useful, but I've found with kids who have developmental trauma, it's usually elevated across the board. So it's a much deeper impact of trauma the scores are expected to be somewhat elevated across all the domains that are assessed, rather than a single incident trauma, which results in kind of a hypervigilance that will spike, but they won't have some of the other symptoms that are present with trauma, or they won't all be elevated very high. So one of my most useful assessments is that clinical developmental assessment. So when we look at the areas that are impacted with developmental trauma, we want to look at what was the prenatal environment, particularly the last trimester. There's a brain circuit that develops during that time that's related to emotion regulation. So we want to look at what was happening for the mother during that time, and was it a period of really high stress? We want to look at their early developmental tasks of walking, talking, toilet training, weaning, and tantrums. Now, tantrums are very interesting and awful for parents, but they're very useful. This is where kids around 2 to 3 years old start to learn frustration tolerance, and they learn it through becoming extremely frustrated, throwing a tantrum, and being soothed by a caregiver in their environment. So we always look for tantrums when we're working with kids that may have developmental impacts for whatever reason. And if they haven't had tantrums when they're around 2, 3, maybe up to 5, you'll see them when they're teens, and they're far worse than when they have them when they're young. So when a parent says, oh my gosh, they tantrum all the time, it was so difficult, I will say I can't tell you how glad I am to hear that, because that will help them learn the frustration tolerance that they'll need in their teen years. We may still have to put some interventions in there to help them with that frustration tolerance, but it's always best if they've had those tantrums earlier in their development. We also look for early disruptions related to attachment. So any losses, separations, going into um, child welfare protection systems, if there was a parent that had an illness, if parents separated during specific developmental times, just to see those disruptions to their relationships early in life. We'll want to look at the attachment strategies that the parent uses and the child uses, and the parent's skills in meeting the child's needs. So that'll tell us where we may need to do some parent coaching in order to build their capacity for having the skills that they need to help support the child's development. And behavioral difficulties, any kind of impulsivity, intrusiveness in adult conversations, eating, sleeping, all of those things can give you a really wide picture of what's happening during developmental times in a child's life and in their current. It can also be a marker of progress that if you kind of repeat an assessment of these behavioral difficulties while you're doing therapy, they usually kind of become lessened, or then you'll know where you need to kind of really intervene or kind of hone in on one particular area. We also look at their social interactions and their adjustment to school. How did they do with friendships? How did they do with teachers? How did they do with all the transitions they go through? Because that's another really big developmental milestone that they have to go through, are all the different changes with attending school. So let's talk about interventions for developmental trauma. So these are more for your younger kids, but they work for teens too. So the first is attachment-based intervention. So under this, you may do some parent coaching where you help the parents build the skills, help them learn to regulate themselves, help them with developing attunement and safety in the parent-child relationship. And then there may be some direct parent-child therapy like TheraPlay or any of those that specifically work with both the parent and child on the relationship itself. We want to make sure there's co-regulation, because co-regulation is critical to attachment. So we may need to have specific interventions to help support the parent's ability to co-regulate. And we really want to build safety in that parent-child relationship, particularly if there's been huge impacts of developmental trauma, because they will not have had that safety in relationships. One of my favorite interventions is mindfulness-based play family therapy. So this is where you do an in-depth assessment. There's parent coaching sessions, and then there's play sessions where imaginative play is used to express those themes and encourage that healing. And it's really kind of a magical process of how over time you see these themes shift and change. And then they kind of get into a time frame where they just play regular, and you'll see the themes kind of reemerge a little bit, but then they'll kind of go down again. And that's when you know that they have reached a point where therapy may be just check-ins, and then pretty soon it'll be over. So that's a great intervention. And in the intergenerational trauma program, there's 4 main interventions that can help support the kids who've been impacted by developmental trauma. There's improving regulation. So that's calming the family nervous system, kind of taking the heat or reactivity out of the family system, or kind of enlivening the interactions if that's kind of shut down or cut off. So that's through parent coaching with autonomic regulation, so teaching them to regulate their own nervous system, supporting attachment, helping them identify attachment behaviors and how to support those to become more secure, creating safety in the parent-child relationship, increasing attunement, and recognizing caregiver burnout and dysregulation, because this is extremely important, because some of these kids can be really difficult to parent. And if the parent's already dealing with their own complex trauma, it just creates a vicious cycle. So we really want to get in there and support the parent so that they are able to do all this. The increase earned secure attachment is also an intervention where it addresses the parent's unresolved trauma. So we want to address that trauma so that they can, through the therapy relationship, have more security in relationships and trust, co-regulation, attunement, so that they know what that feels like and they have the experience to then give that to their child. So it's that unresolved trauma in the parent that interferes with attachment and increases the risk of developmental trauma. So we also want to address the developmental impact. So that's attachment, increasing felt safety, improving parenting for behavioral difficulties, may involve collaborating with schools to get an assessment and any kind of remediation that would help. It's all those things, all those different impacts. We want to look at those and make sure we're addressing those as well. And building connection and family resilience. So it's further supporting that parent-child or teen relationship, connecting with their family history to harness the resilience that's in their family as well. Because wherever you'll see intergenerational trauma, you'll see intergenerational resilience. So before we go into the challenges in maintaining connections, there's a really great question asking if I would be able to record sessions or clips of the mindfulness play imagination. That's the mindfulness-based play family therapy. I am not able to record sessions just because I work with a really vulnerable population, and they already have a lot of violations to their privacy with having thick files and multiple workers and teachers and people that know all their information. It would be great if I could find somebody that I could use kind of as a volunteer that is not an actual client, so it doesn't disrupt their privacy. You could message me though, and I can give you some information of how you can learn that intervention. It's a great intervention. Okay, so challenges in maintaining connections. There's huge impacts in the families facing these developmental traumas and maintaining connection with themselves and with people outside the family. So it's really hard for parents who have their own history of developmental trauma that may now be complex trauma. When that's unresolved, they can have a lot of difficulties maintaining connections and having healthy, supportive relationships. So they may be very shut down and hard to connect with. They may be very volatile. They may kind of, when they hit a point of stress, they may leave the situation. So it's really hard for them to have healthy connections and to work through difficulties and conflicts. They're also under a lot of pressure from outside sources. There's a lot of judgment from people, family members telling them how to parent, what to do, and trying to get them to do things like the old school way where they use a lot of punishment, but we're teaching them to maybe not use punishment because it's going to escalate behaviors. There's judgment from neighbors, from schools. If they've had any involvement in child welfare or protection, that can be very difficult for them as well. So relationships in families impacted by developmental trauma and complex trauma, intergenerational trauma, they can be very unhealthy relationships and very unpredictable. So it can create more instability or continued trauma. So if the relationships are really stormy and even just verbally aggressive, that creates a lot more instability for the children and teens in growing up in that environment. Also, the child is going to have trauma-related behavior. That's normal for them to have that. But when you have a parent that has unresolved complex trauma, it can be very, very triggering for the parent, and they can overread. A child can do something kind of mean to a sibling, and they think the child's a mad killer. they kind of jump to big conclusions because it triggers their own trauma and creates a lot of dysregulation. So parents can be very traumatized by their children. We look at how the parent's trauma impacts the child, but the child's trauma can also re-traumatize the parent. So we always have to be alert for that as well. In the inability to connect in these stormy relationships, they really maintain the chaos in the family system, and it really interferes with attachment. It may be learned behavior, and it may be what they know and what's familiar, so it's always kind of there, but there needs to be shifts and changes when we're trying to help them move forward and lessen the impacts of those traumas. So, parenting strategies and interventions. So, in the context of trauma, um, especially intergenerational trauma, we really want to address that transmission. So, that's um, either in utero, we can't do much about epigenetics, or the environment after birth. So, we really want to address those impacts of the way the trauma is transmitted, usually in the parent-child relationship. And when we do this, it actually empowers the parent and gives them a sense of influence and control. And we don't mean like controlling behavior where they clamp down and control everything with the child. They feel a sense of security within themselves and that they have influence over their child's life, and they have kind of an ability to influence and have things kind of work and have that be accepted. So that's a really good experience of having some control in a parent-child relationship. It also helps provide the environment that's necessary for healthy development and for healing. So we really want to have our parenting strategies and interventions down. So a lot of the best parenting techniques are based on relational neurobiology. So that's Daniel Siegel, Tina Payne Bryson, all of those types of interventions, because these support attunement and attachment, resonance, which is kind of the being able to feel an energy between the two and a connection, which is really important. That's a right-brained, nonverbal experience that helps people feel safe and connected. And all of those lead to better neural integration. So you'll see really good advances in their ability to put things together in a whole and integrate their experiences so that it's not continuing to repeat those trauma patterns. I'll take a quick drink. So parent coaching, if you have a parent that's really easily dysregulated, emotionally dysregulated, coaching can provide a knowledge base, but it also inhibits the emotion dysregulation or the autonomic dysregulation. So it's a top-down intervention that if you have somebody that's very bottom up and has a lot of dysregulation, having the framework of coaching can kind of put limits on that dysregulation because they're tapping into the knowledge base in the higher cortex. It also provides new understanding of behavior of their child or teen and the context. So they kind of can understand and maybe even predict the child's behavior to do better ways of supporting the child or the teen. And so it helps calm the family nervous system by improving the regulation of the parent, the co-regulation between the parent and child through attunement and attachment. So there is another question about, I also use Circle of Security. That's a great one. We have agencies that use that, and it's a great intervention as well. I find if I get too many, I can be familiar with some of the interventions, but if I get spread too thin with training, I won't master one of them. I'll just kind of have pieces of all of them. And with attachment, I really want to master interventions. So now we're going to look at cultural considerations when we're working with developmental trauma. And Our treatment of developmental trauma can't be separated from the family system, and the family system can't be separated from their culture. So we really need to have a good understanding of how to work within a culture that may be different than our own and how to be effective in doing that. So we have to work within the cultural or spiritual beliefs and experiences of our clients and the family for the most effective outcomes, because a lot of people who come from different cultures have experienced racism, uh, horrible traumas that if they don't feel like we understand them, it doesn't resonate safety. So, in order for them to have a sense of safety, we have to be open in working with their cultural beliefs and supporting that and integrating that into their resilience, because every culture has huge points of resilience that if you can tap into those, it really helps move that resilience forward. So, one thing that I find is very important is to continually monitor privilege, thoughts in my head, all those kinds of things, and be aware of the impact that may be happening in therapy in the process, as well as to make changes to have cultural awareness, learning about other cultures, and being sensitive to working with these families effectively. And the biggest reason is that intergenerational trauma, if you're working with somebody from a cultural group that has experienced oppression and racism, that's going to be a key factor in making sure you've kind of addressed that and continue to monitor and continue to work through that with clients. So when I had worked in various settings from prisons to schools, those kinds of things, community mental health. And when I came up to Canada and worked for an Indigenous reserve, which for people in the US, that's a Native American reservation, I had an amazing Indigenous supervisor that was probably the only supervisor that I was terrified of because I wanted everything to be right, because he was just so smart and so good at what he did. I learned so much from him. One of the first things I learned is that all the interventions I had been using, like CBT, some of those kind of interventions, I had to drop all of them because they weren't culturally appropriate for that population. So I had to learn to integrate new culturally appropriate interventions and work within that culture. That was probably one of the best trainings and experiences I could have ever had. Um, so it's important to know that every culture has had some kind of trauma associated with their culture. So the Holocaust, residential schools, colonization, slavery, massacres, wars, racism. We're seeing that unfold right now in our daily lives with everything going on in the world. So we have to be able to work in that context, because that's really going to be a big piece of intergenerational trauma. And if we're in a highly diverse practice, so if we get referrals in an area or serving a population that you may see all kinds of diverse, populations, we can't know all the historical traumas for all groups of people. So if you're in a very diverse practice where you're working in the context of multiple cultures, the main important things are adopting a sense of humility and compassion and curiousness without being intrusive curious, and keeping that privilege in check, and then learning from them as you go, and maybe seeking elders or people who you can learn more about their culture. If we're working with a smaller range of diversity, so maybe I'm in an area where there's a lot of Indigenous people, so that's kind of a smaller range of diversity, although there's tons of diversity within Indigenous cultures. So you're really not out of the woods with working with a smaller range of diversity, but there's common experiences and beliefs that make it easier to really kind of hone in on that and learn that culture and history. And we want to do this so that the client doesn't feel pressure to educate us or teach us on what they've experienced other than their own experience and maybe some variations of their particular neighborhood or their particular family. We don't want them to do the work of educating us. And when we have that understanding, there's an immediate resonance or feeling of safety, and that they don't have to explain all this stuff to us. So it's really important to develop that, whether you're in a highly diverse area or a lesser diverse area. So some examples of culturally sensitive approaches with intergenerational trauma would include searching for intergenerational resilience in previous generations. So that might be a family member who is very resistant, went to jail for fighting against oppression, and all of that. That's a sign of resilience and strength, even though it involves jail and even though it's fighting. That is standing up against racism, and that is really important to harness that strength and try to pull that into the current generations. So another thing that I find very important to do to be culturally sensitive is to look at your intake procedures, your assessments, your interventions that may not be culturally appropriate. Just like I was told CBT, you have to drop that and completely start over and learn all these other interventions. Was the best thing for me, but also probably one of the most shocking moments in my career. So like, I kind of look at it as like the clipboard assessment versus the heart-to-heart conversation and communication. So the clipboard is very, very much part of our training and experience, where we're taking notes, we're getting information. Some people will feel like, wow, that person's really on it. They really want to know this. This is great. Other people who come from more heart-to-heart communication, such as Indigenous people, may find that very off-putting and very kind of artificial, or very not very able to connect with. So we want to immediately, from the first phone call or the first appointment, to communicate through our actions without words that we respect their culture and their beliefs, and we're a safe place for them to seek out that healing and support. And humility is really, it's a small act that has the most meaning for people when we're working with different cultures. Okay, so just in review, we have looked at how developmental trauma impacts our clients who are children and teens, and some of the impacts on parents. We've looked at the emotional, behavioral, social, and cognitive impacts. We've looked at best assessment tools and interventions, challenges that are in the family system to maintain connections with each other, parenting strategies, and cultural considerations. So I would just ask you to reflect on how this week's content can enhance your work specifically with developmental trauma and intergenerational trauma, and see what kind of little shifts or changes you could make to maybe have more cultural openness or sensitivity with some of your clients that are coming from different cultural backgrounds. Again, if you would like to have a copy of the calendar that we're working through, that you can find at calendar.barbarawoodsphd.com. And I hope you enjoyed this. I'd love to hear any reactions, or if you have any suggestions, I would be open to those. So I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next week.